right. Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, everybody. My name is Keith Johnson. I am the program manager. I work at Oregon DEQ for the Cleaner Air Oregon program and work on my team and our extended team with the Oregon Health Authority as well, who is an important partner for us on a number of facilities across the state. And certainly these 4 facilities that we'll talk about tonight. And we got a lot of material to cover, so I'm going to try to keep my remarks somewhat brief so we can get to everybody's good questions on some of the facilities and the work that we're doing. So I do want to start a little bit with just a big thank you to the community, to Charlotte and Mary and others for this opportunity to speak with the community. Community engagement and the work that we do with communities is so important. It's a huge part of this program that started back in 2016 with the Bullseye crisis and really came about because of communities demanding more accountability and demanding a program like this, a health-based kind of air quality permitting program is basically what it is. So what is Cleaner Air Oregon? And it's a very complicated program, as many of you know, as you heard from Greg. So Cleaner Air Oregon is what we call a health-based permitting program for air quality. And it's, we really have one air quality permitting program at DEQ. But this graphic kind of gives you a sense of it's really sort of a bolt-on or addition to our existing permitting program. So, the existing program, the Federal Clean Air Act, really kind of regulates sources based on sort of what do you do? What's your SIC code? And really focuses on sort of larger amounts and a certain type of pollutants that we call criteria pollutants. But Clean Air Oregon addresses what has been called the HAP gap, which is a hazardous air pollutant or air toxics, which the Clean Air Act and our traditional permitting program just hadn't quite evolved to look at. So it really looks at health risks to the community, the surrounding community, and requires these risk assessments, which are very technical in nature and produce a lot of information that can ensure that happens. And it applies to both existing facilities like Columbia Steel and the other ones we'll talk about tonight, but it also applies to larger new facilities. So we've completed and issued permits across Oregon to over 20 new facilities that have done these risk assessments and issued permits that we know meet these safety standards, these health standards. So definitely a step forward in terms of looking at these issues. Next slide. So when we say health-based program, what does that mean? Well, air contaminants, as everybody knows, affect health in a variety of ways. And there are a number of different sort of air toxics or toxic air contaminants that we call them that are released by facilities, but also by our cars and also, a wide range of sources. And they have different health effects and different effects on different organs. And, dealing with the air that we breathe is very personal to us and, can have immediate effects on us, as well as sort of chronic and longer term effects. And so this program looks at both types. It looks at sort of what we call acute or immediate risks, and it also looks at longer term risks and cancer risks as well. So we tend to sum up the risks in a cumulative way so that we're not just looking at individual contaminants, but try to look at how they affect the body as a whole. Next slide. So the basics of the program, some of you who've been to presentations like this have probably seen this slide before, but we call this sort of the 3 R's of what Cleaner Air Oregon does. It starts off with reporting air toxics. So the phase that a facility will go through first is reporting to DEQ what their emissions are of air toxics. And that can take a while, because the level of detail and what needs to be reported is new for facilities. It hasn't been required before, both in sort of the scope and the detail. And we look at these reports very carefully, which is one of the reasons why sometimes we will require more information or require source testing. And some of the facilities that are actually here tonight and in the program across the state have done that testing so that we can better understand it. And I want to underscore how important that emission inventory is. The risk assessment that we do down the road is based on that information. And we look at it, we look at it very carefully as a result. The second R, assess risk. So this is the risk assessment. So this is taking the information and looking at the specific characteristics of the community, where the wind blows, meteorology, and calculating what those different types of risks are. And lastly, the third R, which is if those risks are over the thresholds, certain thresholds, which you'll hear a little bit more about tonight, then facilities are required to make changes to address those risks. And that could be installing pollution control, that could be limiting activities or substituting things. So that is sort of the highest level picture of sort of how the program works. Next slide. So for the next few slides, we're going to get into a little more detail on some of these things, and I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, J.R. Giska, who is Clean Air Oregon's program engineer, who will talk through a little bit more about the details of how the program works.
Thanks, Keith, and thank you all for being here, and thank you for allowing me to be here and talk about this program with you. Can everyone hear me? Okay. Great. So as Keith mentioned, I'm J.R. Giska. I work with the Clean Air Oregon team. I'm the program engineer. I get to work with a bunch of technical folks doing all of these risk assessments and wading through all of this really exciting and interesting and important technical data. So I'm just going to go through sort of the steps of the Clean Air Oregon process in just a little bit more detail and a little bit about this slide right here. So this is essentially a sort of a distilled or condensed version of what the Clean Air Oregon process is. Keith mentioned we start with that emissions inventory, which we will refer to as an EI here. You'll see these circles over and over again when we talk about the four facilities and where they are in here. So just trying to get these integrated in. So first step is the emissions inventory. We'll talk about that. Then there's the modeling protocol, which then gives us some information of how a facility plans to model this. We'll talk about that. And there's different levels of risk assessment, which I'll get into. And for those higher tiers, more complicated risk assessments, it's 1 through 4, they require what we call a risk assessment work plan, which is a little bit more about how the risk will be calculated. And then finally, there's the risk assessment, which gives us that those final numbers for the health risk. And then we move to the permitting aspect of it. So if there's any conditions that we need to put in. Keith mentioned community engagement and how important that is for this program. We do have, formal community engagement steps that are integrated into the program if risks are above certain levels in a risk assessment from a facility. But we also engage the communities throughout this entire process, depending on the community. Some folks we've already met with some of these folks, some of y'all, in regards to Columbia Steel. I know that we met with St. John's a while back. This was even before they had really finalized or submitted an emissions inventory. And so we do this in many parts of the process. So next slide, please. So the emissions inventory is essentially, an accounting of everything that kind of a facility does and everything that gets emitted because of that. So this is, as Keith mentioned, a very critical step in the process. It is often the longest step in our process. We really need to be as accurate as we can be here. We've got to try to get as representative data as we can. And that doesn't just mean the emission side, but that also means what activities a facility does. What are their operations? Are they continuous operations? Are they batch? Where are they taking place in the facility? Are there controls? What are the efficiency of those controls? And also, as Keith mentioned, source testing here at this stage is a vital component of our program to get site-specific emissions data. And we'll talk a little bit more about this when Kenzie Billings goes into the site-specific data. Next slide, please. So once DEQ has reviewed and approved this, and I apologize, I should have mentioned that, at each of the steps along this pathway, the process is essentially that the facility submits their technical deliverable within a specified deadline. We have timelines for them. We do, and our rules allow for extensions. They have to be substantiated. Folks have to tell us why they need them, and they have to be showing us efforts that they've been making to get towards filling those deliverables. But then DEQ reviews, and there's a lot of times there's an iterative loop where we kind of go back and forth, and we get to a number, and then we all get to a place where we agree and it is approved upon. So once DEQ approves the emissions inventory, the next step is the modeling protocol. And this is essentially how we're going to take the amount of emissions that we have in the emissions inventory in, say, pounds per year or pounds per day of some contaminant or pollutant, and get to what people are actually breathing at the ground level. And so for this, we look at items like meteorological data, wind speed and direction, where's the wind blowing, terrain information. So are there, is it flat? Are there hills? Is it in a valley? Are there large buildings around this? Then we look at facility data. So what are the stack heights? Where are they located? And then finally, of course, we integrate the emissions data into that. And this is essentially very much akin to what you'll see every night on your nightly news when you look at the weather. We are really just taking a lot of meteorological data and some other inputs to kind of see where the wind or the snow or the pollutants in this case will move. Next slide, please. So once we do that, for those higher tiers or more complicated, typically larger facilities with higher risk, the levels 3 and 4, they're required to submit what we call a risk assessment work plan. And essentially, this tells us, it's a detailed sort of description of what the exposure locations are around a facility. Where are the schools? Where are the homes? Where are the businesses? And in order to do this, we look at zoning. Our program is based on the underlying zoning in an area, and I've just got sort of an example here of a facility out in the eastern part of the state. And you can see the facilities outlined in a red color here, and different zones are outlined, and we would basically equate different types of exposure locations to those. So one would be residential, one would be schools, and others would be acute. This discussion in the risk assessment work plan also highlights what types of risks we'll be looking at. So cancer, chronic, and acute non-cancer as well, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. And then the highest tier risk assessment that we have, a level 4, there might be some adjustments that are made to some of the assumptions that go into our toxicity values. And this is often the most important point that the community has in reviewing information that comes in during the risk assessment process. We really look to the community here to say, like, hey, are we getting it right? Are they getting it right? Are we getting all the schools? Are we getting the senior centers? Are we getting the veterans, the centers? Like, are we getting all these places? And the daycares and the in-home daycares, is all of that represented correctly here? Because that's really where the local knowledge really comes in and can be very beneficial for our process. Next slide, please. So once that is approved, the facility then submits their final risk assessment. And this tells us what are the health risks and what do they have to do about them. Well, as I mentioned, there's from a level 1 to a level 4. Level 1 is very simple and it overestimates risk. A level 4 is more complex and it more accurately estimates risk. So essentially, level 1, we have lookup tables that we do for those dispersion, for the modeling. It's pretty set, pretty conservative screening type. And then once you get to like a level 3, we're doing a full-blown air dispersion model that requires computers to compute, to simulate. So what do we look at? Well, we look at the risks for cancer, which is a chronic risk. And then we have non-cancer, both chronic and acute. So chronic is annual and acute is over a 24-hour period. These risks we treat as cumulative. So all the cancer risk from all of the chemicals, from all of the activities emitted will be added up to give us that highest cancer risk, and the same for all of these others. And finally, once we do that, we take a look at that and we look at those highest risks and we compare them against what we call risk action levels. And that really tells us where they fall and what they need to do. And that typically informs what type of permitting or risk reduction or controls they need. So here's a graphical representation of those risk action levels. It starts from very low levels where they just need to have a permit. That next level is community engagement, where the facility is required to have a formal community meeting. Above that level, they're required to put on controls to operate or demonstrate to DEQ that they do have the best available control technology. And above that, there's required risk, even if they do have controls. And finally, immediate curtailment levels, which we will not allow a facility to operate over, or a permit to be issued to a new facility if they're above those levels. Next slide, please. So the final step here, we get all this information, we get all this data. What do we do with it? Well, we distill all of this down into some words that go into a permit. And these words are really important because they're legally binding contract, essentially, with the state. And so if a facility is over a level that requires some conditions or limits to their risk, then we will work with the permit writers in our air quality program, permitting program, as Keith mentioned earlier, to develop some of those specific, we call them source risk limits for the CAO conditions. And these are traditionally, there are limits on emissions, production activities, or fuel usage. We also can include some testing, monitoring, and reporting requirements if we'd like to have repeated source testing to ensure that folks are meeting compliance. And we can also have requirements for installation and or operation of pollution control devices. This process typically leads to a public comment period that we typically have with our air quality permitting program. And so this is another key place where public input is highly encouraged. And so with that, I'm going to stop talking about our process and I'm going to turn it back over to Keith. Thank you.
All right, thank you, JR. So I'm going to just speak a little bit about the role of community engagement in Clean Air Oregon, and then we'll get into a look and review of the work being done at each facility. So just a little bit of a note here. We've mentioned some of this already, but these are the principles that we sort of orbit around a little bit as we think about community engagement internally to DEQ. And these principles actually come out of a what we call a guidance document called a community engagement toolkit that we published a draft of earlier this year, and will actually be coming out with the final copy and posting that on our website. And these are also informed by principles directly from the Environmental Justice Task Force and some of their principles, and we sort of took a look at those and brought those in. So I won't read these; they're on the slide here. I just want to say that it's new. It's a little bit new for DEQ to sort of look at community engagement this deliberately in a program. Other programs at DEQ certainly have in public engagement in terms of public hearings on permits and things like that, and Cleaner Air Oregon does too. But Clean Air Oregon really calls out specific engagement beyond those types of things. And Some of it's in the rule. Some of this language is sitting in the rules, and there are requirements. And as JR mentioned, over certain levels, we have formal engagement that create fees that the facility needs to pay to hold these meetings. But some of it is more discretionary, and so we're still learning as we go, as we do this. It's still a newer program, and we're sort of a state agency, and we have a lot. We know that we have a lot to learn on how to do this work and do it well and do it in a meaningful way. Next slide. So a couple of these slides here that I want to highlight is really just getting the word out of what we have on the web for communities that can be accessed. So we have, obviously, I'm sure everybody knows we have a Clean Air Oregon web page. Lauren, thanks for putting that link in the chat. And there is a section there for that lists specifically the facilities conducting Cleaner Air Oregon health risk assessments. And so what this does, these are a number of, you'll see this list with a number of statewide facilities, mostly existing facilities, some new. But if you go to these pages, next slide, please. This is sort of an example of one of the pages that's listed in the previous slide. We really try to create some transparency and put all the sort of formal communications and documents that we've received from a facility or we've sent to a facility, list them on this webpage. And you can see that there's a contact if you want to speak with the project manager, who's working with the DEQ project manager who's overseeing this. And then there's also a button there on the red circle on how to get involved in just some general announcements. But on the right-hand side, I know this is a lot of information on the slide, but this is what you'll see online is you can see copies of all the formal communications. And part of our program that's a little bit different for air quality is really to have some formal communication back and forth. This is between DEQ and the facility. This is an important part of accountability that we have to communities and that the facility makes to DEQ. It's really important because most of these steps are enforceable. They have enforceable requirements in terms of documents being submitted on time. And so it's really important to be clear on what the expectations are and be able to have that record out there. So anyone can go and look at this information for any of these facilities. Next slide. At a sort of more general level, I want to highlight that DEQ has what we call a Gov Delivery service. You can go to our main homepage, and there's a link on this slide as well. And you can sign up to receive informational updates on just about anything, anything and everything from DEQ. But you can also sort of customize the information you want to hear about, so that you're not, getting permit notifications for water quality issues, in Baker City, sort of a thing. Cleaner Air Oregon has its own update. And under Gov Delivery, we tend to put sort of our more significant announcements that aren't quite press release level, but if we update new documents or a certain facility is, hit an important milestone, there might be some information on that. So encourage folks to go and sign up for that. And I know many of you already have. Next slide. So important areas for feedback. I think we sort of covered some of that. JR did earlier, but making sure that we understand the nature of the community and how to assess risks is a really important part of the communication and the interaction that we have. Some DEQ people live in neighborhoods that these assessments are going on, and some don't. We want to make sure we understand your lived experiences as far as what's going on where, and some of these have made differences in these assessments. But our community engagement program doesn't stop there. We, in certain facilities that have a lot of concern around them, we have folks giving us input on a source test plan. And in some other parts of the state and other Clean Air Oregon facilities, there's less community involvement. There's just it's sort of a different approach. But the idea is to get folks involved and make sure folks understand what's going on. So a little bit here on how you can stay involved. I think this is really just sort of a summary slide. So you can sign up for these things. A couple of general program things. I think I mentioned we're going to have the toolkit, which describes the considerations we have for doing community engagement around each facility. And once that's published, I think we'll put the notice out on GovDelivery so folks can see that. We actually have a dedicated staff person to do community engagement. Unfortunately, that our previous community engagement coordinator took another job this summer, and we are still working to rehire that position. But it's definitely very important for us to get that moving forward. So anyway, I'll stop there. And I think the next slide are questions, which I think we'll look for questions on the material covered so far. And what comes after this is going to be the specific facility updates.
All right, so I think next up is, first we're going to take some questions here. I know, Charlie, you've also been tracking on questions. And so are there ones you're seeing most frequently, or I can go ahead.
Yes.
See you sent some to me too.
I gathered the ones and I stacked them and I sent them to you. So I think those
perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, then we will start with these. So when will the Owens, Brockway, and Columbia Steel risk assessments be publicly released, and why the very long delays? So I think I'm looking to JR. Am I picking on you?
Sure. This actually, I mean, we will talk about these facilities in our next segment, but I mean, essentially, like I noted before, the facilities submit these technical deliverables to DEQ. DEQ staff has to review and approve these, and so a lot of times there's an iterative loop that goes on here. And so essentially that is what's going on right now. So we are reviewing these and issuing comment letters to the different facilities. And I think Owens, you'll hear where they're at, and Columbia Steel, you hear exactly where they're at later. But I'll just say that it's a new program. It's a complicated program. There's a lot of information. The facilities that we've prioritized to call in first, two of those you mentioned, there's a lot going on there, and we want to make sure that we get it as right as we can. And so that is why it takes us the time that it takes us to review these items.
Thanks.
But they will be made available as soon as we've approved them, and also any communications and comment letters will be made available once we send them out.
Perfect, thanks. Yeah, and when JR is saying made available, that's on those facility pages that we linked to in the chat. So I'm gonna ask one more question Charlotte gave to me, and then Alex, I see your hand. So toxic emissions from EcoLube can happen in sudden bursts of varying length of time rather than a constant thing. Air inversions can make the fumes hang around the neighborhood for longer. Does the modeling average things out? If so, it may not recognize how serious the problem can be for breathability of residents, especially those with asthma or other health conditions. Yeah, so great question about the modeling. We did notice a modeler from DEQ, Phil Allen, is on the line. So Phil, if you don't mind us tapping into your knowledge on short notice here, if you can speak sort of to modeling to the extent we need to kind of describe things in more detail in writing, and if we don't get to questions, we'll certainly do that later.
Okay, hi everyone. I think there's really two issues here. The first is the emission side. and let me answer that first. Yes, so for the acute exposure modeling, we're looking at a 24-hour average so that emissions that occur periodically or if you will, maybe spasmodically over that 24 hours will all be included as a 24-hour average emission. And then for the chronic and cancer, they're spread out over a year. So yes, the episodic nature of those emissions would be captured. The inversions is more difficult question or a more difficult part of the modeling. It's likely that the meteorology that we use in the model is not able to capture the details of those inversions, particularly if they're low to the ground. And we use the best information we have available, but we may not be able to truly capture the effect of that capping lid of temperature change. So I think that's what I would have to to respond to that.
Thank you. And Alex, you have your hand up.
Thank you, Lauren, and thanks DEQ staff for the presentation tonight. I appreciate it. My question is about cumulative impacts. So you mentioned previously that impacts were measured cumulatively. Is that on a facility by facility basis, or does that include overlapping facilities? So I work for the Portland Harbor Community Coalition, and one of the issues that we hear from the community all the time is, you know, I'm not just in the airshed of one facility, but I'm in the airshed of a Superfund site and a contaminated site over here, and you know, multiple air emission sites here. So is there any mechanism in Clean Air Oregon to evaluate those cumulative emissions from different facilities on the same neighborhoods?
Great question, Alex. The short answer is no. Clean Air Oregon program really just applies to an individual facility and the risk thereon. There were some proposals initially that would have created a process to sort of look at areas and add those risks together, but those did not make it into the final rules. I will say, however, there is provisions for what we call an area risk pilot program that would have us look at a specific area somewhere in Portland and sort of do a study, as it were, to look at actually do some evaluation of what those cumulative risks are on sort of a pilot basis. It wouldn't necessarily create sort of enforceability around those things, but it's a pilot program to look at it. So I know that's probably more of a convoluted answer than you were looking for, but the short answer is it really just applies to that individual facility.
If I can add something here, is that there is available data on EPA's NACA website. So it's NADA, excuse me, the National Air Toxics Assessment that does have combined not just facility emissions, but it also puts in transportation emissions, area source emissions, other emissions that CAO wouldn't take into account. And that data is available online. They do it once every 3 years, I believe, based on information they get from facilities in the National Emissions Inventory. So there is some data out there on that. It just won't be to maybe the level of resolution that a CAO risk assessment would be.
Okay, great, thank you. So we have some questions in here that Charlotte has sent me about prioritization. So, you know, about different facilities like Bullseye and TriMet and Brooklyn Intermodal Rail Yard and where they are on the prioritization list. So maybe JR, you can kind of like orient folks to how we went about prioritizing the facilities.
Sure, yeah, thank you. Great question. So, you know, as the rules were being developed, DEQ essentially sent an information request out on over 600 chemicals for potential emissions for emissions inventory information to all of the permitted facilities in the state. And so we got that data back, and for I'd say 360 plus facilities that are permitted at simple, standard, and Title V permit levels, just our higher levels of permitting. We basically performed a prioritization that took into account the emissions, the amounts of emissions, and the different pollutants of each type and the toxicities. And then we also looked at some demographic data, population around these facilities, and some other demographic data related to age, income, and we put all those together to come up with what we got, what we called a prioritization score. That we also combined that with some qualitative data, and kind of came up with our lists. So we have 3 groups of prioritization: Group 1, Group 2. We'll hear a little bit about this in a minute. They both have 20 facilities. We're working through Group 1 right now, and we're hoping to get that finished out here, maybe early next year, of calling them in. But as far as who has been called in and why, so Bullseye essentially, triggering or precipitating this whole program, that the development and adoption of these rules kind of went through their own risk assessment already when the colored art glass manufacturing rules were developed, and essentially put on what we would consider to be the toxic's best available control technology. So right now, their reductions in emissions show that, and so that's why they're a little lower down in Group 3. And as far as the rail yards, that is not right now a source that Clean Air Oregon has sort of prioritized. It doesn't mean it's not a source that CAO in the future could not ask for risk assessment on, but right now for our prioritization, we looked at permitted facilities only. And those facilities are not required to have a permit in our air quality permitting program.
Great, thank you. And we got one more question. I think to stay on track, we got to move on to the next bit of our presentation, but keep putting things in the chat. These are great. Let me track it. All right, so Columbia Steel, and I know we're going to get into the specifics later, but they're partway through their toxics assessment process. So in mid-July, DEQ reported finding toxic levels of manganese above allowable levels. Knowing this, has DEQ committed additional staff and resources to completing the final risk assessment report for review? Is DEQ prioritizing, sorry, my thing jumped, prioritizing community health by moving quickly to a risk reduction plan for Columbia Steel? So if someone can speak to that.
Yeah, I'll answer this. Some of the details I think will come out when we get to that facility and talk about sort of some of the specifics, but absolutely, it's a priority for us to move this site forward. And each step of the way requires sort of a different set of expertise, whether it's a modeler or a risk assessor, depending on where we're at in the process. So yeah, definitely a priority. The work at Columbia Steel has been really complex. As everyone knows, it's an older facility. And so a lot of this information was sort of captured as new. And there's been a lot of good new information that we've gotten. So yes, we're moving forward as quickly as possible on a lot of different fronts, as you'll hear tonight.